Everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen had two favorite hobbies: gossiping about her neighbors and calling 911 whenever someone so much as sneezed in a way she didn't approve of. She thrived on control, on the feeling that she was the unofficial sheriff of the community, even though her real title was nothing more than HOA president of a subdivision that had only been around for a couple of decades. But in her mind, that title meant power. It meant authority. It meant she could dictate who belonged and who didn't, who deserved to be left alone, and who needed to be kept in line. So when Karen saw a tall black man working on a farm that stretched just beyond the manicured lawns of her HOA community, something inside her snapped. She couldn't believe her eyes at first. Tractors moving across the soil, cattle grazing. Behind a wooden fence, rows of pecan trees reaching toward the sky. She narrowed her gaze, her fingers gripping the steering wheel, as her SUV rolled slowly down the road like a predator stalking its prey. This, she thought, could not be allowed. The man was strong-looking, built like someone who had worked the land his whole life. Sweat glistened across his brow as he hammered a new fence post into the dirt. He was focused, calm, and steady, the kind of person who didn't look over his shoulder for anyone's approval. And that alone irritated Karen. She thrived on being acknowledged, feared, or at least noticed. But this man didn't even glance in her direction, didn't even pause his work to register her presence. She rolled down her window sharply, the sound of glass scraping in its track punctuating the silence. "Excuse me?" she barked, her tone already dripping with hostility. The man paused only long enough to look up. His dark eyes met hers with an unreadable calm, and then he returned to his work, setting the next post. Karen's face tightened. "I said excuse me. What exactly do you think you're doing here? Farms aren't allowed. You can't just put up animals and barns and equipment wherever you please. This is a neighborhood with rules. Rules that keep it safe and respectable." Finally, he turned toward her fully, planting the hammer against his thigh. He stood tall, his frame casting a long shadow against the fence line. "Ma'am," he said evenly, his voice deep and steady, "this is my land. It always has been. You're outside your HOA boundary. Whatever rules you think you have, don't apply here." Karen gasped, as if he had spat in her face. "Don't you dare talk back to me. This entire area falls under our HOA oversight, and I won't have it ruined by someone ignoring the standards we work so hard to maintain." He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown, just wiped his brow with a rag, glanced at the fence, and then back at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't make the rules here, not on this property. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations, long before your HOA ever existed, and it'll be here long after your board meetings are done." Karen's lips pinched into a thin, furious line. "We'll see about that," she hissed. Before jerking her SUV into drive and speeding off in a spray of gravel, Marcus Johnson, because that was the man's name, stood there for a moment, watching. The dust settled behind her car. He wasn't surprised. He dealt with people like her his whole life, people who thought rules and appearances gave them the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. But Marcus was unshakable. He'd grown up on this land, learned every hill, every tree, every turn of the soil. This was his place, his anchor, and no self-righteous HOA president was going to take that away from him. Still, he knew trouble when he saw it. He went back to his work, but his mind stayed sharp, ready for whatever came next. It didn't take long. Minutes later, the peaceful hum of the countryside was shattered by the distant wail of sirens. Marcus sighed, leaning on his hammer. Enough. 3 squad cars sped up the gravel road, their lights flashing red and blue, their sirens slicing through the still morning air. Neighbors who lived closer to the HOA boundary began to emerge, their heads poking out from behind hedges and porch railings. Phones in hand, eager to capture whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Karen's SUV pulled up right behind the cops, her face glowing with smug satisfaction. She stepped out like a queen arriving at court, pointing dramatically at Marcus as though she had uncovered some terrible villain. "There, it's the man. He's dangerous. I told you he was up to no." "Good." The officers, tense from the call they had just raced to, immediately focused on Marcus. Hands hovered near holsters. Their voices carried authority. "Sir," the lead officer called out, "we received a report of a suspicious person on private property. Can you identify yourself?" Marcus didn't move. He stayed steady, standing tall in the dirt with his hammer at his side. His dark eyes flicked toward Karen, who stood smirking, her arms crossed, waiting for the spectacle she thought she had orchestrated. "He can't identify himself," she crowed. "He doesn't belong here. Just put him in cuffs already before he causes real trouble." The crowd of onlookers murmured, phones raised higher, anticipation thick in the air. Marcus exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, making sure every officer could see his movement. He pulled out a black leather wallet, flipped it open, and held it high. The gold badge glinted in the sunlight. "Special Agent Marcus Johnson," he said clearly, his voice resonant. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Effect was instant. The officers' postures shifted, their hands dropping from their belts. Their eyes widened, then hardened not at Marcus, but at Karen. They straightened, their demeanor changing from suspicion to respect. Karen's jaw dropped. She stood frozen, her lips twitching, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? FBI? That can't be real?" Marcus lowered the badge just enough for everyone to see the authority etched into it. "It's real," he said evenly. "You just called 911 on a federal agent standing on his own land." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, some laughing, some gasping. Karen's triumphant expression dissolved into shock, her face flushing red as every pair of eyes turned to her. The lead officer turned toward her sharply. "Ma'am, did you knowingly file a false report?" Karen stammered, her words tumbling over one another. I thought he looked suspicious. He doesn't belong here." Marcus's gaze was steady, unyielding, suspicious. "For what? For fixing a fence on the farm that's been in my family since before your HOA even existed? Or suspicious because I don't look like the neighbors you're used to?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause, the only sound the faint hum of the police radios. Karen's face contorted, but no words came. She glanced around at the crowd, at the phones recording, at the officers staring her down, and for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't the one in control. And Marcus, calm as ever, stood there holding his badge like a mirror reflecting back her own ugliness. The silence after. Marcus revealed his badge was thick enough to choke on. Karen, for once in her life, couldn't find her voice. The smug confidence that had fueled her every step up until this moment evaporated like mist under a blazing sun. The neighbors who had gathered shifted uncomfortably, some whispering into their phones, others smirking behind cupped hands as they recorded every second of the unfolding drama. The lead officer cleared his throat. His tone, which only moments ago had been authoritative and suspicious, was now deferential. "Agent Johnson, we weren't aware. We're responding based on the information given." "No disrespect intended, sir." Marcus kept his calm composure, his face unreadable. He had worn that mask countless times in interrogation rooms, undercover stings, and high-stakes raids. It was a face that revealed nothing, but inside, his blood simmered. Not at the officers, he could tell by their hesitation that they were just reacting to the call. His anger was reserved for the woman standing to the side, still trembling with indignation and fear, who had dragged him into this circus. Karen finally sputtered, her voice high-pitched and cracking. He's lying. That badge is fake. It has to be. People like him don't become FBI agents." The neighbors gasped audibly at her choice of words. Phones in the crowd zoomed in on her, as though everyone recognized that this moment, venom in her tone, the ugliness of her accusation, would be the nail in her coffin. Marcus didn't flinch. He stepped forward slowly, measured every bit the embodiment of federal authority. With a controlled motion, he withdrew another item. From his wallet, a government-issued ID card with his photo, credentials, and clearance level. He handed it to the lead officer, who scrutinized it carefully before nodding, then returning it with both hands as though it were a sacred document. His credentials check out. "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, turning to Karen with a look of disdain. This is a federal agent standing on his own land. Karen's jaw slackened again, her face blotching red with both embarrassment and rage. But, he doesn't act enough, Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through her, sputtering like a blade. His eyes locked on her, calm but searing with authority. Got data. You called 911 claiming there was a dangerous trespasser here. You escalated a situation without evidence, without reason except for whatever prejudice you carry inside you. You put me, these officers, and even your own neighbors at risk because of your reckless call. Do you understand the gravity of that? Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked like a puppet with its strings cut, sagging under the weight of every camera lens pointed at her. Marcus turned his attention to the officers. I want this documented every second. False 911 calls are a crime, especially when they're based on fabricated danger. The lead officer nodded. Yes, Agent Johnson. We'll be filing a report immediately. Body cameras captured the interaction, and given the circumstances. He paused, glancing at Karen, whose eyes were darting wildly like a trapped animal. It may be turned over to the district attorney. Karen gasped like she'd been struck. You can't do that. I'm the HOA president. I have rights. Marcus gave a slow, humorless chuckle. You're not above the law. In fact, your title means nothing out here. This farm is federal jurisdiction now, by extension of my employment, and more importantly, it's my family land. You're lucky. This didn't end worse, considering the way you escalated it. Karen's knees nearly buckled. She reached for the side of her SUV, clutching it for support, realizing for the first time in years that she wasn't the one wielding the power. Neighbors shifted, some whispering harshly. She finally messed with the wrong person, one muttered. Serves her right, said another. A few even laughed under their breath, but Marcus wasn't finished. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so it carried with quiet steel. Do you know what happens when people like you keep making false reports? Innocent lives get endangered. Officers walk into situations expecting violence, and somebody ends up hurt or worse. I've buried friends who died because someone couldn't see past their own fear or hate. Think about that next time you pick up the phone, because the consequences of your actions reach a lot further than your little HOA. Karen's mouth trembled, but she had no rebuttal. Her eyes flicked to the phones recording her to the officers, watching, to the neighbors who no longer supported her. For the first time in her reign as HOA president, she wasn't being obeyed. She was being judged. The lead officer, sensing the shift, cleared his throat again. Agent Johnson, is there anything further you'd like us to do here? Marcus looked at Karen for a long, unblinking moment. He could have demanded her arrest. He could have filed charges right then and there. But instead, he chose something far more devastating. Not yet, he said finally. But the report stays on file. And believe me, I'll be following up. This community deserves better leadership than someone who calls the cops every time she sees something she doesn't like. Maybe the HOA board should reconsider who's fit to represent them. The implication hung in the air like thunder. Karen's face turned ghostly pale as the realization hit her position. Her title, her only source of power in this world, was now dangling by a thread. The officers gave Marcus a respectful nod before retreating to their vehicles. The neighbors lingered a moment longer, murmuring, their eyes fixed on Karen like vultures circling a wounded animal. Then one by one, they began to disperse, leaving her standing there, small and pitiful against the backdrop of Marcus's sprawling. Marcus turned his back to her, walking calmly toward the fence he had been building, picking up his hammer once more. He didn't need to say anything else. The silence spoke louder than words, the sound of a man utterly unshaken. Resuming his work while she stood shattered, Karen lingered for a few seconds longer, her pride battling with humiliation. But the weight of the cameras, the stares, and the badge she could never hope to challenge finally broke her. Without another word, she scrambled back into her SUV, slammed the door, and sped away, her tires spitting gravel as though she could outrun her own disgrace. But she couldn't. Not this time, because by the time she reached her driveway, videos of the encounter were already uploading across neighborhood group chats, social media, and local community boards. Her face, twisted in rage and disbelief, was already trending in the worst way possible. Every word she had said, every accusation she had hurled, every ounce of her arrogance was now immortalized on dozens of recordings. And against it all stood Marcus, calm, composed, and dignified, the image of strength in the face of bigotry. The storm had only just begun, and Karen was at the center of it. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his work as if nothing had happened. He set another fence post, the steady rhythm of his hammer echoing across the fields. Inside, though, he knew the fallout was going to be bigger than Karen could imagine. And when it came, he intended to be ready not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been on the receiving end of people like her, because Marcus Johnson wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't just a man fixing a fence. He was an FBI agent, sworn to protect and uphold the law. And today, the law had come home to his farm, and this time it was Karen who had to answer for her actions. The days that followed were nothing short of chaos for Karen, though. For Marcus, life carried on with the same steady rhythm it always had. Each morning he rose before dawn, made himself a strong cup of coffee, and walked his land with the quiet pride of a man tending to something greater than himself. His farm had always been a sanctuary, a living reminder of his family's perseverance and legacy. But as he went about his chores, mending fences, feeding livestock, and prepping equipment for the next harvest, he could feel a shift in the air. The neighbors who used to glance over warily now waved with hesitant smiles. Some even stopped by to apologize for never standing up to Karen before. It was subtle, but Marcus knew Karen's grip on power was slipping. Karen, on the other hand, was drowning. The video of her meltdown had spread faster than wildfire. Local news stations picked it up within 24 hours, then regional outlets carried it further. Soon, she was the subject of online forums and hashtags, her reputation dissected with merciless glee. Clips of her saying people like him don't become FBI agents circulated endlessly. Memes sprouted up overnight, painting her as a symbol of arrogance and prejudice. Neighbors she once bossed around no longer returned her calls. Even the most loyal board members of the HOA began avoiding her, but the worst was yet to come. At the next HOA board meeting, Karen strode in with her usual air of superiority, though her face betrayed the sleepless nights she had endured. Circles clung under her eyes, and the corners of her mouth sagged from stress. She slammed her binder of community complaints on the table as if the sound alone might reassert her authority. "Order," she barked, glaring at the gathered members. But instead of the silence she expected, the room filled with murmurs. People didn't avert their gazes anymore, they stared her down, fueled by the memory of the video. Finally, one man raised his voice. It was a quiet neighbor named Tom, who had lived in the community for nearly 20 years. "Karen, we all saw what happened," he said firmly. "What? You called the police on Marcus without reason. You lied about him trespassing on his own property, and worse, you put everyone at risk. That's not leadership. That's abuse." Face flushed crimson. "I was protecting the community," she snapped. "He was building something without permits. He was acting suspiciously. I was doing my duty." Another woman, Angela, stood up, her voice dripping with disgust. "Your duty? You nearly caused a tragedy. That man is an FBI agent, Karen. Do you even realize what could have happened if the officers had approached him expecting violence? Someone could have died because of your lies." The murmurs turned into open rebukes. "She's a liability. She doesn't represent us. Can't afford her leading the HOA anymore." Karen slammed her hands on the table. "It's built this HOA. Without me, this community would fall apart. None of you have the spine to enforce the rules. Ungrateful." But her voice cracked, the power behind her words faltering. She was no longer the woman who intimidated neighbors with threats of fines and violations. She was cornered prey, lashing out in desperation. Tom leaned forward, folding his hands. "Karen, the board has already voted. You're being removed as HOA president, effective immediately." The gasp that escaped her lips was audible across the room. She looked around wildly, expecting anyone to defend her. But all she saw were cold, tired faces. People who had endured her tyranny for years were finally free, and the relief in their eyes was unmistakable. "No. No, you can't do this to me," Karen shrieked. This is my community, my rules. You can't." But the gavel came down hard and final. The board members rose from their seats, leaving her trembling in the chair, staring at the binder she had once wielded like a weapon. For the first time, Karen realized she had nothing. No allies, no authority, no power. Meanwhile, Marcus learned of the meeting through his neighbors, many of whom stopped by his farm to deliver the news with satisfied smiles. Some even brought pies, casseroles, and bottles of wine, as though they were offering peace offerings. For the years they hadn't stood up to Karen, Marcus accepted them graciously, his calm demeanor putting everyone at ease. He didn't gloat, didn't rub salt in the wound, simply nodded and said, "The truth always comes out one way or another." But his quiet justice wasn't finished. A week later, Karen received an official notice from the district attorney's office. The police report filed after the incident, combined with the body cam footage and Marcus's statement, had been reviewed. She was being charged with filing a false police report, misuse of emergency services, and reckless endangerment. Each count carried fines and the possibility of community service. When she read the letter, her world crumbled completely. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood as though she owned it now faced criminal charges. Sleep, couldn't eat. She dreaded stepping outside, knowing neighbors whispered behind their blinds. Parents pulled their children away when she walked by, not out of fear, but disgust. The final blow came when she tried to sell her house, hoping to escape the humiliation. Realtors turned her down, saying her reputation had tainted the property's value. Prospective buyers backed out after recognizing her name from the viral video. She was trapped, her empire reduced to rubble around her. Marcus, on the other hand, thrived. His farm flourished as more people in the community began supporting him. He even hosted a neighborhood gathering one weekend, inviting families to bring their kids to see the animals and share in a barbecue. It was the first time many had set foot on his land, and they marveled at the beauty of the place. What had once been a symbol of suspicion and fear, thanks to Karen's lies, became a cornerstone of community pride. At the gathering, one young boy tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Mister, are you really an FBI agent?" he asked wide-eyed. Marcus chuckled softly, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "I am. But more important than that, I'm someone who stands up for what's right, and you can be that too, no matter what anyone tells you." The boy grinned, and his parents smiled with gratitude. Marcus knew then that the ordeal had done more than expose Karen. It had planted seeds of change. Weeks later, Marcus found himself walking the perimeter of his farm again at dawn. The air was crisp, the sky painted with streaks of orange and purple. He paused at the fence he had been building the day Karen had called the police. It stood tall and strong now, stretching across the property, a quiet testament to resilience. He leaned on it for a moment, reflecting on how quickly things had unraveled for Karen. She had tried to strip him of his dignity, to make him small. Instead, she had exposed her own ugliness for the world to see. The irony was almost poetic. As he turned back toward the house, Marcus spotted a car pulling slowly into the long dirt driveway. To his surprise, Karen stepped out. She looked nothing like the woman he had confronted weeks ago. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes carried the hollow weight of defeat. Marcus crossed his arms, waiting as she approached. She stopped a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably. I came to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong about everything. I let my power, my fear, and my pride control me, and I hurt people. I hurt you." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. He studied her, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke. "Me, you need to apologize too. It's this community. You betrayed their trust. You endangered lives. But if you're truly sorry, then prove it, change how you live." Karen's eyes welled with tears, and she nodded before turning to leave. Marcus didn't stop her. He wasn't interested in her downfall anymore. That chapter was closed, because in the end the farm still stood. The truth had prevailed, and Karen had been forced to face the consequences of her own actions. Justice had been served not with vengeance, but with clarity. And as Marcus returned to his work, the sun rising higher over his land, he smiled faintly. The farm was peaceful again, the community stronger, and Karen, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder that when you try to use power unjustly, you may just end up destroying yourself. The story had ended exactly the way it should, with the right person standing tall, and the wrong one brought low by her own hand. The end.